Do you ever knock on wood when you say something lucky? Most people do. You probably did it just last week without thinking about it. Maybe you do it after saying something hopeful. Maybe your parents taught you when you were small. You might tap your desk at work or knock on a door frame. People all over the world do this every single day. In offices when talking about promotions. At home when discussing health. On the street when mentioning good news. We all do the same quick tap 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 motion. But this simple habit is over 2,000 years old. It comes from a much darker place than you might think. It comes from ancient forests where people believed dangerous spirits lived in every tree. Hi everyone. Today we're going to learn where knocking on wood really comes from. And trust me, the real story will surprise you. It starts with Celtic Druids who knew something about the spirit world that we've completely forgotten. Today, knocking on wood is pretty simple and harmless. You say something positive about your life. Then you quickly find the nearest piece of wood and give it a few taps. Maybe you say knock on wood out loud. Some people do it differently around the world. In Brazil, people knock exactly 3 times after mentioning something bad that could happen. In Britain, they often say touch wood instead. Americans usually do the classic rap 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 on any wooden surface they can find. It happens everywhere you can imagine. Business meetings when someone mentions hitting their sales targets. Dinner tables when families talk about staying healthy. Classrooms when students discuss passing exams. Even hospitals when doctors mention patient recoveries. Most people think they do it for simple good luck. To keep bad fortune away from something positive they just said. It's like putting a protective shield around their words. Nothing too serious or scary about it. You probably do this without even thinking about it anymore. Your hand automatically reaches for the nearest wooden table or door. It's become as natural as saying bless you after a sneeze. Just a quick social habit that makes everyone feel a little better. But this wasn't always so harmless. This wasn't always just about luck. 2,000 years ago, this simple tap could mean the difference between life and death. Back in the Celtic Iron Age, around 700 BCE to 400 CE, people first wrote about this practice. Celtic Druids and common people alike believed trees held incredible spiritual power. Every forest was alive with invisible forces. Ancient Roman historians like Strabo documented what they saw in Celtic lands. They wrote about people approaching sacred groves with careful rituals. They described druids who could speak directly to tree spirits. These weren't just stories. These were official historical records. Back then, Celtic people did it very differently than we do today. They didn't just casually tap any piece of wood. They approached specific sacred trees with great ceremony. Oak, ash, and hawthorn trees were the most powerful. There were signs it meant something much more serious in Celtic Britain and Ireland. Archaeological sites show wooden altars carved with protective symbols. Ancient settlements built around sacred groves. Celtic artifacts covered in tree imagery and spiritual markings. This was happening when Celtic warriors painted themselves blue for battle. When druids performed human sacrifices in forest clearings. When people believed the spirit world was just as real as the physical world around them. The entire Celtic universe was alive with supernatural forces. The Celtic people who practiced this lived in roundhouses made of wood and stone. They farmed the land but still depended on forests for everything. Wood for fires, tools, weapons, and shelter. But most importantly, trees were their direct connection to the gods and spirits who controlled their fate. Researchers at Oxford University found something interesting in 2018 when they studied ancient Celtic spiritual practices. They discovered that tree worship wasn't just religious ceremony. It was daily survival technique in a world full of supernatural dangers. They figured it out by studying Celtic archaeological sites across Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. Ancient wooden artifacts preserved in peat bogs. Celtic stone carvings showing people touching sacred trees. Written accounts from Roman observers who witnessed these rituals firsthand. What they looked at were thousands of Celtic religious sites from the Iron Age period. Sacred groves where druids performed ceremonies. Wooden temples buried underground for centuries. Celtic graves containing wooden charms and tree branch artifacts. They discovered this practice started in Celtic Britain around 700 BCE, much earlier than anyone expected. The Celts weren't just knocking for luck. They were literally communicating with powerful tree spirits who could protect them or destroy them completely. Other discoveries supported this main finding. Celtic metalwork showing tree spirits with human faces. Ancient Celtic laws that made cutting certain trees punishable by death. DNA evidence showing Celtic communities deliberately planted sacred groves around their settlements. Why this matters is huge for understanding our modern habit. What we think is simple good luck actually comes from an ancient survival system. The Celts developed this practice because they believed their lives depended on keeping tree spirits happy and protective. Daily life in Celtic Iron Age Britain was hard and dangerous in ways we can barely imagine. People lived in small tribal communities surrounded by dark, endless forests. Winter meant possible starvation. Summer meant raids from enemy tribes. Disease could kill entire families in days. Celtic people feared invisible supernatural forces that controlled everything in their lives. Evil spirits that brought sickness and crop failure. Vengeful ghosts of the dead who haunted sacred places. Forest demons that could steal children or drive adults mad with terror and confusion. The real reason Celtic people knocked on trees was protection from these supernatural threats. They believed tree spirits called dryads lived inside every oak, ash, and hawthorn tree. These spirits could either shield you from harm or allow terrible things to happen to you and your family. People in Celtic Britain thought knocking on tree trunks would wake up the protective spirits inside. The spirits would hear your request for safety and create a barrier around you. Without this protection, you were completely vulnerable to every evil force in the supernatural world. The historical ritual details were much more complex than our modern version. Celts approached sacred trees at specific times of day. They brought offerings of food, flowers, or small metal objects. They spoke ancient Celtic prayers while touching the tree bark with both hands pressed flat against the surface. If they forgot to do this in Celtic times, they believed terrible consequences would follow immediately. Crops would fail, livestock would sicken and die, children would be stolen by evil spirits, warriors would fall in battle, entire families could be cursed for generations. The scary historical part was that tree spirits had their own personalities and moods. Some were kind and protective, others were easily offended and vengeful. Celtic people had to learn which trees were safe to approach and which ones might trap their souls forever. Real historical consequences were severe according to Celtic beliefs. Disrespecting a tree spirit could bring years of bad luck. Cutting down a sacred tree without permission meant certain death. Even accidentally damaging tree bark could result in supernatural punishment that lasted for generations of your bloodline. People in different parts of Celtic Britain, Ireland, and Gaul all did this same practice. From Scottish Highlands to Welsh valleys to Irish coastal villages. Every Celtic community developed their own version of tree spirit communication. The basic principle stayed exactly the same across hundreds of miles. It traveled historically through Celtic trade routes and tribal connections. Celtic druids moved between communities sharing spiritual knowledge. Warriors carried protective tree rituals to battles in distant lands. Celtic merchants spread these practices to trading settlements across Iron Age Europe. Same historical fears, same spiritual solution. Celtic people everywhere were afraid of the same supernatural forces. Evil spirits that brought death and destruction. Angry ghosts seeking revenge. Forest demons that hunted human souls. Every Celtic community needed the same protection from tree spirits. Different historical regions adapted it to their local sacred trees. Scottish Celts favored ancient oak groves and highland valleys. Welsh Celts preferred ash trees growing near mountain streams. Irish Celts considered hawthorn trees the most spiritually powerful of all Celtic sacred trees. This worked for ancient Celtic people because it gave them real psychological comfort in a terrifying world. When everything around you could kill you, disease, starvation, enemy raids, wild animals, having spiritual protection felt absolutely necessary for basic survival. Celtic parents taught their children these tree rituals from the earliest possible age. 3-year-old Celtic children learned to touch tree bark properly. By age 7, they knew which trees were sacred and which were dangerous. By adolescence, tree spirit communication was as natural as speaking their native Celtic language. The practice survived through the specific challenges of Celtic Iron Age life because it addressed their deepest fears. Fear of supernatural punishment, fear of losing divine protection, fear of being helpless against invisible forces that controlled their destiny in this harsh, dangerous world. As Roman armies conquered Celtic lands, the tree spirit beliefs slowly started to change. Roman culture was less focused on forest spirits and more on organized gods and goddesses. But Celtic people secretly kept their tree rituals alive even under Roman rule. During the medieval period, Christian missionaries tried to replace Celtic tree worship with Christian symbols. They convinced people that knocking on wood connected to Jesus Christ's wooden cross. This allowed the practice to survive, but changed its spiritual meaning completely from Celtic tree spirits to Christian protection. Different European cultures adapted Celtic tree rituals in their own ways. Germanic tribes had similar tree spirit beliefs. Scandinavian people developed their own version with Norse mythology. Slavic cultures created tree protection rituals that lasted well into the modern era across Eastern Europe. What got lost through the centuries was the serious, supernatural element that made it so important. The specific knowledge of which trees held which kinds of spirits, the elaborate Celtic rituals and offerings, the deep spiritual connection between humans and the forest that surrounded them. What survived through history was the basic physical action and the general idea of protection, the simple knocking motion, the belief that would somehow offer spiritual safety, the automatic response to seek wooden objects when hoping for good fortune or protection from bad luck. Something deep inside us still remembers those ancient Celtic times when forests were full of spirits. Even though we live in cities and suburbs now, our brains still carry the genetic memory of our ancestors who needed tree spirit protection to survive. Modern psychology explains this as inherited behavioral patterns. Our Celtic ancestors who practiced tree protection rituals were more likely to survive and have children. Over many generations, this cautious, spiritual behavior became part of our unconscious mental programming that activates automatically. Even today, knocking on wood makes us feel a little more secure when we've tempted fate. It's a tiny action that gives our nervous system the signal that we've taken protective steps. Our modern brains still respond to the same psychological triggers that helped our Celtic ancestors feel safer. Scientists call this cultural transmission of survival behaviors. Habits that once helped people survive get passed down through generations even when the original danger no longer exists. We knock on wood because our Celtic ancestors needed tree spirit protection in a world full of supernatural threats. So next time you knock on wood after mentioning something good in your life, you'll know it comes from Celtic people who lived 2,000 years ago in the forests of ancient Britain and Ireland. People who believed tree spirits could literally save their lives. Understanding these ancient Celtic origins changes how we see this simple superstition. It's not just a silly habit. It's a direct connection to our ancestors who developed sophisticated spiritual practices to survive in a dangerous, mystical world where every tree held the power of life and death. Thanks for watching. I hope this made you think about how ancient Celtic fears and wisdom still influence what you do every single day. Next time you hear that familiar tap 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 on wood, you'll remember the Celtic druids who first discovered the spiritual power hidden inside every tree. See you next time.